This is the shore, and the waves keep crushing in.
Welcome to the International War Veteran podcast Blood, Diamonds and Gold. Today on the show, Mark Ryan, great actor and Hollywood star, British intelligence corps and profiler. He did play Robin of Sherwood and Che Guevara, and was the sword master in the Hollywood film King Arthur. We talk about his time in Zambia, drama, stage drama and life from Berlin, a city that had a wall too. Welcome.
Good evening.
Good evening. How are you?
Oh, I'm grand. Sound. Yeah, thank you for sharing with my audience.
No, not a problem. Not a problem.
Okay, so Mr. Ryan, you were born when and where?
I was born in the Yorkshire town of Doncaster, which is famous for a couple of things. And my camera, for some reason, the lighting keeps fading in and out. I don't know whether it's just because I move or something. Famous for several things. It used to be in the heartland of the coal mining industry in Yorkshire. So it was part of the Rotherham, Sheffield steel conurbation. So Doncaster was at the tail end of that, and it was a big mining town as well as a horse racing town and market town, one of the biggest markets in Europe for the farmers and for produce and that kind of stuff. And so it was a very important town on the route north and south from London to York. And so I grew up literally in the middle of all of that history and all of that industrial, I don't know what you call it, industrial revolution history there as well in Doncaster. So in the 50s. So I was, born in the 50s and grew up in the 60s in Yorkshire. So that's basically.
Your father was in the military, no?
My father was in the RAF, but all of my uncles obviously served during World War II. So my father was in the RAF. Two uncles were actually at the Battle of Monte Cassino and survived to tell the tale. One uncle was actually on the convoy runs in the North Sea, I believe later on to Russia as well. And one uncle was in Burma, and one uncle was in North Africa, and then in Europe. And I had two that were captured. And were held as prisoners of war for the quite a bit of the chunk of the war. So we grew up with that military tradition, and of course there'd also been the Malayan uprising, and there was conscription, and there was various other things that Britain had got itself into, that we was kind of just surrounded by a military history. People talking about these far-flung corners of the world where they'd been and served and had these experiences, and it was just something that we grew up with. I remember my father's, I only talked about this the other day, one of my earliest memories is my father's Irving flying jacket on the back of the cellar head steps to the coal cellar, and he had his Irving the bottoms and the top of his flying suit hanging on the back of the cellar door. I remember my dad at one point used to wear it during the winter because he was a bricklayer and a builder. He would wear it, out in the cold weather, and he'd left it somewhere. And I went to try and pick it up. And my dad had said to me, he said, "You won't be able to pick that up. You will not be able to pick that Irving flying jacket up." And I remember as a kid trying to pick this sheepskin original, flying jacket up, and I couldn't pick it up. It was so heavy. So we just kind of grew up with that tradition.
And what was your first call? Are you a born rock star?
Am I a born what? Rock star?
Yeah.
I was very musical from a very early age. I could sing before I could talk. My mother had often said to me that, I was in the back garden singing. It's funny because my daughter's the same. Very musical right from the very beginning, and I used to be wandering up and down the garden singing to myself little tunes and stuff. So I was always very musical, but my father was musical as well. I mean, the war interrupted his career as a singer, and when he got back and when everything settled down again in the 50s, he was as a crooner. So he was singing with the bands and big bands and that kind of stuff. But I was, like I say, I was very musical as a kid. So again, it was just something that was there. It was always in my atmosphere, you know.
Yeah, some people grow up, I think, wake up and want to become a rock star, and then they just become it. I did interview lots of metal musicians. Yeah.
Well, there was no metal musicians. I mean, my dad was obviously into the great crooners. I don't know what's going on with that. The great crooners and the singers. So I grew up with that. I grew up with the music of the 50s. Rock really wasn't something that was in my. Again, it wasn't something that I got into till much later on. I think my first album was that I bought was Atom Heart Mother, Pink Floyd. I think that was the first album that I could actually afford to buy. So even then, I was kind of into the odd rock, and I wasn't into your standard rock sort of stuff. So it was something I fell into. Although I did, buy a guitar very early on, or I was given a guitar. Then I bought a guitar, and then got into working in the working men's clubs myself as a musician and a singer. So it was a gradual process. It wasn't something that was set in concrete. Although I did go to singing lessons and was more into the theatrical musical side of things. That's how I ended up in Evita and doing other musical stuff in the West End.
In 1970, Black Sabbath, when you were 14, released their first album. Do you remember this?
I remember, I think the first Black Sabbath album that I listened to was it Stormbringer that did the album Stormbringer? Or was that somebody else? And the only reason I listened to it, pal of mine had it, was because it was I thought it was based on Michael Moorcock's series of books about Elric of Melnebony. And so I thought the whole Stormbringer thing was going to be part of this album. It wasn't. I was very disappointed. But heavy metal wasn't something that featured in my youth at all, really, until much later on, until I did get into Pink Floyd and various other, The Who. Again, I like The Who and I like Pink Floyd because I like the concept albums. But I also liked Marvin Welsh and Farrah and things like that. I liked odd things of Bowie, and Bowie was just on the edge there. He actually played Doncaster. I didn't go, funny enough. My brother went and saw him play live, said he was brilliant. But obviously, most of it was dominated by the Beatles. My youth was dominated by the Beatles growing up.
Who's your favorite?
Favorite Beatles song?
No, Beatle and song.
Oh, I don't know if I had a favorite Beatle. I think I always found John a little bit acerbic, which apparently he was. And obviously, I liked Paul McCartney's lyrical as well as musical abilities. But as a package, they were just so outstanding as writers and original thinkers that there was so many different musical ideas within the Beatles that it's impossible to even classify them, really. I mean, they're still probably the number one rock band, pop band of all time, and their musical ability and their, George Martin was obviously a huge influence on them, but in terms of what they produced and brought out, the ideas that they brought out musically, they're still probably the most unique rock band that certainly Liverpool, if not Britain, has ever produced.
And how did you then get into the idea of joining the army?
It was always there, as was music. It was always something that was a part of my background, and so I was fascinated by history. We grew up obviously we had relatives. Uncle Albert was in the First World War and was killed just outside of Passchendaele, and so we grew up with this history of not just the Second World War but the First World War. So the history of that was very much a part of growing up in Northern England, so it was always there, and I was always fascinated by the military and firearms, and still am. I still shoot regularly when I'm back in California, and I have one of those brains that could absorb a lot of information. And like a lot of kids in the UK, if we didn't have a toy gun, we made one, whether it was out of Lego or out of something else. I actually made a toy Sten gun out of a piece of tree branch, nailed a magazine to it, and I was trying to understand the mechanics of how a Sten gun worked so that I could actually make one. And that kind of thing. You just we grew up with it. It was part of our, the information.
You heard a lot about you had a lot of hero stories, no war stories. What did you get to hear? I mean, when you hear when you hear war stories, you hear when you get them told directly, sometimes cruel stuff. Was that?
Yeah, I mean, both my uncles that were prisoners. One was a prisoner of the Japanese in Burma. That was a pretty horrendous experience. And he very rarely talked about it. Uncle Eric, who was probably my favorite uncle. And I think Uncle Eric was the first person that bought me a toy gun. He bought me a Tommy gun. And I remember discussing it with him because he carried a Tommy gun in the jungles of Burma. And he came back from Burma pretty badly mangled from being a prisoner of war of the Japanese. He very rarely talked about it, although you could see he was very proud, quietly proud of his service. And my Uncle Victor had been a prisoner, first of all, of the Italians, and he was handed later on to the German army. And I think he had a pretty bad time as well because he was an officer. But he obviously, it was still a rough time for him. And he talked a little bit about what had happened to him as a prisoner, and it certainly wasn't pretty. It certainly left the scars on him, as it did in a lot of people's psyches in Britain. That period of after the war through the 50s and 60s was still scarred. People were still scarred. There was still rationing, don't forget, in Britain, I think probably to the late 40s. And things were in short supply, and Britain was pretty much bankrupt. So, they struggled through the 60s, and things then sort of picked up a little bit late 60s into the 70s. But it was just one of those things that, again, you absorbed it without really thinking about it. It was always something that was there that I thought maybe one day, if I got the opportunity, I would throw myself into it and see, it was something that I think other members of my family had done. And so it's like, okay, well, let's find out. But the music industry and the entertainment industry came first. And so I ended up working as a musician, as a singer, and doing shows and stuff in the West End before fully got involved with the military. Although, as you probably read the book, when I was in Africa, I came across all manner of folks in Central Africa. And you have to remember, it's kind of reflective, really, of today in many ways. Zambia was in the middle of a clandestine war between the CIA and the British and the Russians and the Chinese and the Cubans and just about everybody else. So around Zambia, there was all manner of clandestine war going on, terrorism and some of it against apartheid and, all that kind of stuff. So again, I didn't realize what I'd stepped into. It was my first major trip overseas, and certainly to Africa, of all places. And there was this very different world. I've often said, somehow you can leave Africa, but Africa never leaves you. It stays with you. It somehow gets into the pores of your skin. And and into psyche. There's something about it which is primal and vibrant, and yet can be savage, and can be and yet full of this amazing joy of life, and wildlife, and everything else. So it was quite an experience, and I came back from that in 76, I think it was, or 75 or 76, and it changed me. The whole experience changed me. I saw things there that were pretty horrifying, and I saw some stuff. I met some people that obviously had piqued the interest of some folks in the intelligence business. I just didn't know what I was doing. I mean, I was pretty naive. I would talk to anybody because I was, playing music and doing things in these hotels, the Edinburgh Hotel in Kitwe, which is next door to the Rokana mine, which is one of the biggest copper mines in the world. And then later in Lusaka, where the Russians and the Americans and the Chinese and just about everybody else was vying to get control of the vast copper reserves that there were in Zambia. Nothing changes really. That's what this is about in Afghanistan. It's about minerals and copper and trade routes, and even then the Chinese were building railroads through the heart of the African bush to try and get into the copper business. So nothing's changed. It's all gone kind of in full circle.
The Rhodesian veterans, Second World War veterans, just received medals in Zambia. The British,
Oh, really?
Prince Harry was there, I think, just to present them the medals. But how I couldn't imagine, like, because how it is when you land there, and I've just been to the north of Africa, and then how would you know who's the Tsapu or who's the zebra, and how are the people? How did you arrive there? And was it just all easy life, or?
Well, like a lot of things that have happened in my life, sometimes it's just sheer naivety, and that it seems to have informed some of the things that I've done, which normally I might have thought twice about and gone, maybe that's not such a good idea, and I wouldn't have done it had I known what I was walking into. But at the time, I didn't know what I was walking into, and I didn't realize that Zambia was in the middle of this. And there's a staging area for various groups, guerrilla groups, and various intelligence, and struggle for control of these natural resources. So I wasn't aware of that till I got there a bit more. But even when I got there, it was such a complex situation. It wasn't something there was no manual. You don't read the manual. Like now there are books about all of this, but at the time there wasn't. And so I just got on with what I was doing, playing music and working with the band and all that kind of stuff, and doing what I was doing, and didn't really think about it until a little bit later when I got to Lusaka. And I realized, because I was being approached by people, I was being approached by refugee members of various governments, because I guess I was, different, and I was, obviously I wasn't a military person. I wasn't somebody that seemed a threat. So people would come up and sit and chat to me about music and about the world, and invite me to dinner or invite me to the casino, which they did. And so I would go and talk to these people, not understanding that they were connected to various organizations or various governments. It went over my heads, but I would talk to them normally, and they would tell me their life story. They would tell me about them, their country, whether one of the chefs was Lebanese. So he taught me a lot about the civil war in Lebanon, which again, I knew very little about. And so I kind of became, later on, a human intelligence sponge, because people would just talk to me, and I would let them talk to me and probably ask them very simple questions about their lives, and they would tell me their lives. And that must have piqued the interest of somebody. And then later on, I met some Americans all wearing Hawaiian shirts with 357 Magnums strapped to them. And we got talking about other things. And most of those guys were in the Vietnam War and had come back from Vietnam. And they had this habit of drinking sake out of the fridge or out of the freezer. And again, I had not connected it till later on that apparently on their days, when they got a break from, you know, being in the jungles of Vietnam, they would be flown to Japan, and they would be downing these small tins of sake that they bought, and they liked it cold. They liked it literally out of the freezer or out of the fridge. So there we were sitting drinking very ice cold sake and talking about their time in the jungles of Vietnam, and where they'd worked and who they'd worked with, and the casino business and the relationships within the casino business. And again, I just absorbed it. I was a young man that was having an adventure, and this stuff just flowed through my awareness.
Did you meet any Germans?
I don't think I did. I met South Africans. I met Rhodesians. I met all kinds of different people, but I didn't meet any Germans. However, what I did find out later on when I was doing black sails, when I went to Robben Island, it's kind of funny because I did talk to people about this, but this, again, it didn't strike me at the time. What happened was I was on Robben Island, and one of the guys that was guiding us around and showing us Nelson Mandela Cell and the training area where they used to do exercise and stuff like that, he talked about how he had been recruited in Mozambique, had then been flown north and then was shuttled to East Germany, where he was trained by the Stasi and trained with them. And he was very honest about it in demolitions and assassinations and all the dirty tricks that they could teach him. And then he was brought back and infiltrated back into then Rhodesia through Zambia. So that line that was going on in the background, where people were recruited and were sent to East Germany, was very much in these people's history. And he was very honest and open about what he'd done, you know, blowing up trains and causing mayhem and all kinds of different things. And that was the only linkage, but that was later. That's when I was doing black sails.
Yeah, in Mozambique, in the Civil War, the former DDR did fight against West German troops.
There was a from what I remember of my figures, there was something like 70,000 Cuban troops in Mozambique, and at the time, Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe were operating out of the southern part of the Zambezi River and going into Rhodesia, and then the Rhodesians would come across, as they did, a patrol from wasn't the Stellar Scouts, I believe it was our squadron of the Special Air Service, drove over the border into Lusaka and blew up Joshua Nkomo's house in Lusaka, just to let him know. And I actually saw, this is in the book as well, but it's true story. I was on the Knife Edge Bridge on the Zambian side of the Zambezi River, and there's a train bridge there. And what happened was that because both countries were landlocked, the only people they could trade with was each other or other sides, east and west and south. But if they wanted to trade with each other, particularly copper or anything else, luxury goods, televisions, and, you know, vinyl records in those days and stuff like that, and cloth so they could make dresses and, you know, tablecloths and God knows else, it had to come one way or the other. So I was stood there on this. I've gone out the night before, actually, which was insane, apparently, because they actually sent out a search party, because I wandered down and went down to the Knife Edge Bridge to watch this full moon over this bridge and the water coming over, because it was just the beginning or the end of the rainy season. So the air was full of moisture from the falls. and I watched the moon, the full moon, in these moon bows literally forming around a full moon. And I'd walk down in the darkness. And anyway, when I got back, the manager was berserk. He went, where have you been? We've got people out looking for you. They thought I'd been eaten by a tiger or something, you know. He said, don't do that again. We'll get somebody to take you down with a group down to the falls tomorrow. Don't go out there in the dark on your own. There are things out there that will eat you. So again, totally naive. Anyway, the next day I went down there, and we went down with 2 or 3 people to look, and I ended up wandering down this little edge of this bridge, and there was this railway down the bottom, and this train came out halfway across the bridge from the Zambian side. The guys got out and went back to Zambia, leaving the train in the middle of the bridge. And then these little dots came out from the Rhodesian side, got in the train and drove the train back to the Rhodesian side. And then there was a pause of some 20, 30 minutes, and the train came back out again from the Rhodesian side, stopped in the middle of the bridge. The guys got out and went back, and then the guys from the Zambian side came out and got in the train and drove it back over onto the Zambian side. And while this was going on, 2 what were then vampire jets, Rhodesian vampire jets, flew up the valley, the Zambezi Valley, and I heard the thump, thump, thump of what sounded like things being dropped further up the valley. And I looked down, and there were these figures that looked like they were crossing from the Zambian side into the Rhodesian side, across the side of the river, and across where they could across the rocks. So while this trade of copper being traded for color televisions and record players and white wine and all that was going on, this train went backwards and forwards. There was vampire jets bombing somebody up the coastline, and probably guys that were going from Zambia into Rhodesia to do all manner of terrible things. So that I saw how the world worked, that all the time the trade went on while the war carried on.
And life as such, it was just carry on, keep calm, or did you see mayhem, or how did you see?
I saw the results, I would guess, of it can't be described as a genocide. And I guess there would be historians now that will be jumping all over this, but there was a small riot in one of the townships, and the students were given a monthly bag of basically mealie meal, which is basically like muesli. That was their food supply. They got one of those a month as their food ration, and that was being cut to 1 bag between 2, or half a bag, or whatever it was. And some of the students had gone out and were out in the streets and broken a couple of windows, and the police turned up and shot them. So I was there probably a little while after that had just happened, again, not knowing this had actually happened, and the bodies were still on the streets. So it happens, you see things that you're not supposed to see. And I do remember that they were all armed with Sterling submachine guns, which was a British machine gun at the time. So I was thinking, that's weird. They're all armed with British weapons, and because it was a Commonwealth country. So I guess the police had gone up there and either got rocks thrown at them, and looks like they'd opened fire on a few people.
Wow. And then you were, and did something change your life then from Zambia from then on? Yeah.
I think I grew up quickly from that point on. I think that experience of being in that environment, and also, as it says in the book, I came to the notice of somebody because I was approached and debriefed about my experiences and told never to discuss it and all that kind of stuff. And I obviously bumped into some people that were figures that people were interested in. And so that was kind of like my first contact with what I would term to be the intelligence services. And but it wasn't something I was really that fascinated in doing. It was it was an experience. It was something that was informative, but I was still on my musical track. So my first West End show was a show called Dean, about the life of James Dean, which was then it was the Casino Theatre. And then that theatre became the Prince Edward Theatre. My next show was Evita. So I ended up playing Magaldi in Evita, which that changed my life. It changed my career, and that changed my life. And the next role after that, I was lucky enough by Harold Prince to move from playing Magaldi to playing Shay. I think I'm the only person in the world that Harold Prince allowed to move from one part into another part in the same production. We talk about this as a whole group online called High Flying Adore, where they talk to all the old cast members of Evita, both with the Broadway production, the West End, and all the places it was played. And so this is something of a story that, you know, I'm the only person that was allowed to do that, and also was in the film. And to the end, to getting towards the end of my run in Evita, I was playing Che Guevara. Obviously, I had to do a bit of research on Che, and that is when things started to I started to put things together about Cuba and America and revolution and all that kind of stuff. And also during that time, of course, the IRA had a very live bombing campaign in London. So, you know, it was something that you grew up with. I mean, the IRA blew up Harrods, and various were blowing up, you know, barracks and things like that. So it was something that was there in the back of your mind. It was always something that you had to be aware of.
There were several bombings in 1967, 76.
Yeah. Horrendous atrocities carried out by the IRA on British soil. So it was something that you were made aware of because of that. You know, I actually did, when I was leaving school, I did one of my things was about the conflict in Ireland, to which a lot of British people didn't understand, and in many ways still don't. You know, I love Ireland and I love the Irish, and I've spent much time there. I'm not being a Christian. The whole concept of Catholics and Protestants blowing each other up because it's the same God, I does not compute to me. It doesn't make any sense, and it never did. So I'll just state for the record, I mean, to me, the three major religions in the world, it's all the same God. It's all the same source. Whether you're a Muslim, you have the Jewish faith, or you're a Christian faith, with all the diasporas of different people within those religions, it all is the same source. You know, I struggle sometimes to understand, well, if it's the same source, you know, why would I go back to that old Norman Mailer, I think it's quote, you know, either God is all good or not all powerful, or he's all powerful and not all good. So, you know, not that I believe that there is a God in the way that most religions perceive it to be. I have my own faith system, if you like, which has got nothing to do with God, I'm afraid. It's more to do with science than it is to do with anything else. But anyway, to finish that little thing, then as we got to the end of me playing Shay in Evita, Ian Sharp, the director, I knew Lewis Collins from both from professionals and previously up in Manchester, and I ended up being cast in the film Who Dares Wins. And that's when really I met, you know, I was already training, if you like, towards the end of my run in Evita. I thought I was going to go and try out for one of the regiments just to see if I could as a reservist. So it was there. And so I was already doing that towards the end of the Evita run. But then along came Who Dares Wins, and that kind of changed a lot of things.
Would did you want to be Robin Horsfall?
Yeah, I may have met Robin. I don't know. I may have met several of these chaps along the way. Certainly, I know that when we were doing Who Dares Wins, there were several guys that worked on the film I only found out a little while ago that he's actually now passed away. But one of the people who challenged me actually to go on selection was Pete Scully. Peter Scully, I only found out a little while ago, was actually dead. And Rusty Furman, on another interview, was talking to somebody else, and Rusty came on, and he didn't know, I guess, that I knew who he was, because I know that Lewis went to Sterling Lions when we were preparing the film, and I know that he got shown around, and Rusty was one of the guys that took him around. Lou told me later on, and because Lou was already in the parish, 10 para, he'd already passed the selection with 10 para, and then wanted to go on selection, but he was too high profile, and they told him that. There's a lot of discussion, just been a lot of bullshit, BS online about, I have it from Lou's own mouth. So he may have been economical with the truth, but I know he went on selection, and I know he passed the first phase, and he was pulled off because he was too high profile. That's what he told me. That's what other people told me that knew him well. So I had been challenged by Pete Scully to go on selection for the reserve element, 2-1 SAS myself. So even during the filming, I was still thinking, oh, maybe I'll try this. So when we actually finished the film and the film came out, in fact, I still have Peter Scully's tie. I actually have Peter Scully's tie in my apartment in California. Just reminded me. And he went, there you go. So I spent then a year after finishing Evita training, because I thought I was going to go either for selection for the parachute regiment or for special forces. And I would have been a trooper. Yeah, I would have been just a basic, it was just a physical thing. I wanted to find out whether I could do it or not, and whether I was I was told by other people that I'd probably do okay. So I trained and trained and trained, and then along came Robin of Sherwood. And I had a choice to make, because I trained for a year and I suddenly had to commit to Robin of Sherwood, or not do Robin of Sherwood and go on selection. And I made the right choice. I did Robin of Sherwood. Don't regret it,
Well, you then, but you kept on doing intelligence. You did security.
Well, yeah, I was an avid shooter. So was Lou and a couple of my mates. We shot on a regular basis in the UK before it, after Dunblane, of course, quite rightly, they shut it all down. But I was, fascinated by all of that side of it. And I got approached by an investigations company to do some work on a couple of cases, high profile cases. One of them, in fact, was the assassination of Olaf Palmer. So there was things like that came along, which again must have put me on somebody's radar. I won't go into all of that, because it's a kind of a strange esoteric story. But that was the kind of thing that suddenly was coming up on my radar. But I wasn't trained as a private investigator. I was taken under somebody's wing who was highly experienced and very well connected in all of these dark, strange places. And we did a lot of work together. And I guess I just had a natural thing for it. And it wasn't until probably the late 80s that I considered going back on selection again. And when we did actually go down and chat to them and talk to the people that I was interested in, but I was actually advised that not to go on selection again, but to go to apply to the intelligence corps, or they would be interested in talking to me. So I, in fact, and I'd actually looked, the first paperwork I have from the Corps is probably in 1986. So this had been in the back of my head since the 80s, 86, 87. Again, Robin of Sherwood was in my life, and so were other shows. So you needed the time to do it. Anyway, by the time it got to sort of 1991, I had the time to do it, 1991. And I was a little bit old then for this kind of thing, but decided, oh, give it a shot, and was told that they would be happy to put me on the course. And I know people think that, you know, it's like James Bond. They just hand you a tuxedo and a Walther PPK and go off you go. It's not like that. There's a 2 or 3 year training process to get through everything that needs to be done. It's a long process. It's very intense, both the security side and the intelligence side, as well as physically intense as well. And they're testing you mentally all the time to see how you react to different things, to see what particular area that you might fit into. And I guess I fitted into the combat intelligence side of things, which meant I could go on the ground with the troops as an intelligence operator. And yet I also had this weird bent of background in show business and writing. So the human intelligence thing came along as a natural progression from me being trained officially and getting my lanyard as an intelligence operator.
So you did some counter operational intelligence and spying and listening to the enemy.
Combat intelligence is about is not looking at your own forces. It's about looking at the enemy. It's about studying the enemy and what you think they're going to do. And my daughter agrees with me. And so it's about putting yourself through the looking glass and looking at what the possible enemy is going to do, what their tactics are, understanding their equipment. And again, I had a kind of a bent, I've got this weird, almost photographic memory for equipment, and I could memorize. I had photographs in my head of what various vehicles look like, various tanks, various APCs, various rocket launcher systems, everything you could think of. I have these images still in my head of them, and I was able to describe things that I'd seen pretty easily. I could absorb the technical details of them. So that was something that I kind of excelled at. But it was also the human side of it, which I was fascinated by, what motivated people, why they'd done what they'd done. So those two areas I worked in was basically, I went on the ground on exercise, whether it was 1BR Corps in Germany. I worked in Germany a lot, worked with the Americans in Germany a lot. And various other places, but I also went off with the pool boys, the special boats, went off on Fearless and went off on various places, exercises, doing stuff that a combat intelligence officer would do. At that point, I was a non-commissioned officer, so it was something that and I enjoyed it. I'll be honest with you, I had a great time.
So how would you characterize Che Guevara?
Che Guevara.
Yeah.
Well, Che, we were having this discussion the other day, and I think in Ivica it changed as well. I mean, originally Harold Prince's view was Che as the Che, what the world remembers him as the revolutionary, this romantic figure. Although I think later histories regarding some of the violence and executions that he was involved with, he may have been a very different character later on in the revolution than he was at the beginning. I may just move my daughter in a minute because she's obviously sitting there getting, she wants to know where her bottle is. So we might have to take a break in a minute. Okay. I might have to give a bottle. Che, I think, is a very complex character. I mean, he started out in Argentina as a student. He was studying chemicals and chemistry, and he wanted to possibly be a biologist, and was working at some point, I believe, on making insecticide for helping the crops grow better and all that kind of stuff. And then somehow he took this weird turn, watching Eva Peron, how her husband basically dominated the country, and that's when it affected his thinking. He became a revolutionary, went to Cuba. There's a mixed bag of history from the romantic figure of Che to the total sociopath. he was involved with a lot of executions and cruel incidents in Cuba. So whether he was swung that way by the Castros, we will never know. But by that point, I think he'd also become a thorn in the side of the Castro brothers, and that's why they sent him off to Bolivia, and that's of course where he was finally hunted down and killed by the American Special Forces. So for a long time, I think that they said they threw his body out of a helicopter into the bush so that they would never find his body and he couldn't be, you know, the grave. But apparently that didn't happen. That was to put people off the trail, and he was actually buried secretly. And the guys that buried him know where he is and have identified his grave. But you know, all part of the dirty side of warfare.
So is that how you study a person, from the history, or just situative? Can you tell? Do you learn lots about body language in that courses?
Sure. It was something I was interested in as well, but certainly in the human intelligence side, you're trying to watch somebody's eyes, you're trying to watch somebody's body language, you're trying to see whether you think they're lying or not and telling you stories. And it's not always foolproof. I have to say, I've actually been partially taken in by people, but they usually give themselves away. And I've been involved with a couple of cases where you would believe the person is telling you the most outrageous stuff, and people believed it. And I was like, there's something about this that doesn't ring true. And I'll say this because it's true. And when I've taught people, and I've worked with intelligence organizations and in America with certain counter-terror organizations, if your gut tells you there's something wrong, there's something wrong, because we take in millions, billions of pieces of information a second. Somebody's eyes, somebody's voice, somebody's mannerisms. We take all of this information in, and as modern human beings, what would normally ring a bell in the back of your head if you were out hunting a lion or something, we don't have that anymore. We skip down to Sainsbury's if you want to buy a steak. You don't have to go and actually hunt the thing down and kill it yourself. And so we've lost a lot of those natural instincts that we have. Smell, just the whole thing, the way that a person reacts. But we take in all that information. And so if your gut is telling you there's something wrong, it's because somewhere in the back of your primordial brain, you're getting signals from that person that they're either deflecting, they're not telling you the truth, or they're being deceptive. There's something about what they're saying and the way that they're saying it that is setting off alarm bells in the back of your head. And if you talk to any good detective that's worked on any murder, sitting down with somebody that's committed a homicide or something like that, they know it's an instinct that they follow, and they have to keep following it until the person either breaks or just keeps lying, and then they prove to them, no, you did it, you committed this. I have been hired to do that. I have been hired to sit down with somebody that has committed a homicide and has been asked, do you think they did it? And I've gone, oh yeah, they did it. They can deny it as much as they like, but I know they did it. And then later on, it was proven that they did it. So those are experiences you kind of take away with you, you know.
You also went to Bosnia.
I didn't go to Bosnia. I worked on some of the human intelligence in the UK regarding the conflict. And I had many people that also worked on that, including my own son. And Bosnia was something that, however peripheral that you touched it, it had a resounding effect on your human and your humanity, because of the amount of atrocities that were carried out. And the particular group that I was working with dealt a lot with the atrocities and the war crimes aspect of it, and that information was then fed either directly to the Hague, the International Court here, or to other people that were investigating these crimes and were hoping to bring some of these people to justice. So I worked on it on a peripheral on a peripheral side. A lot of us, they wouldn't deploy directly, although, however, I have to say the work that the unit that I spent some time with and bounced along occasionally with was made up all of civilian. The bosses may have been regular soldiers, but most of the people doing the work were all civilians who took what they used to call S-type engagements. And the reason that they did that, and they're very honest about it, they were saying that military people with a military background or bearing, particularly in these situations, get spotted immediately. Whereas civilians who have come through the back door have got a kind of like a softer edge, which you need if you're trying to debrief somebody, particularly the victim of a war crime. You don't want the, just give me the facts, Jack approach. You need to reel them in slowly so they tell you their story, and you have to build an empathetic bridge with them. And for some reason, this little group was very good at doing that. And the Ministry of Defense recognized that and recruited people directly from civilian life who were reserve soldiers, particularly from the intelligence corps. So that work was very effective in bringing some of these people, criminals, to justice.
So you worked with refugees, so that was or from who came from Yugoslavia.
Yeah, a lot of the victims that came. I don't know what I can really tell you that isn't probably best left to the history books, because pieces broken out there, and without wanting to point fingers in any particular direction, but it affected a lot of people. I can't remember his name now, but the colonel that was in charge of the British troops, one of the things that we were shown was the footage of the colonel. I can't remember his name, forgive me. I believe it was he was taken over by the then commander of the Special Air Service, and it would have been a massacre in Croatia where people had come in and massacred this Muslim family and put the entire family in the cellar and burned them alive. And he went in to see this for himself because he couldn't believe that anybody would be this cruel. It would be that horrible. And sure enough, that's what he witnessed. And when he came out from underneath the house, from the cellar, they literally shoved the camera in his face. And you could see that he was psychologically stunned. You could see that he was emotionally unhinged by what he had just seen. And so that was one of the other things that was learned from the Ministry of Defense, was you have to prepare people for this, because what you're going to witness is going to be worse than your worst nightmare. And sure enough, some of the things that we discovered were worse than any horror film that you've ever seen. The acts that were committed by people on both sides, mainly one side, however, you couldn't make it up for a film. You couldn't do it. There's no film, whether it's a Saw or a Freddy Krueger or any of these films, horror films, would ever come near to what the human being is capable of doing to his fellow man in reality. And that was another switch in my head, that when human beings can be pretty cruel.